Thank you all for attending today. My name is Sophie, I work with Victorina Press, and I'm here to represent them today. If you've noticed, we do have the camera on at the back, and it has a very sensitive microphone, so if during the event try and keep whispers to a minimum, that would be very helpful. We do appreciate that. Obviously, please, when asked if you would like to, it makes you feel better. Try and social distance as best as you can. Just be aware of COVID. Don't be randomly touching people you don't know. But today we are here to celebrate the launch and publication of The Search by Jennifer, which we are very, very proud that you decided to publish with us. Thank you very much. I hope you all enjoy it. I will not be doing the interview this evening even. It will be done by Steve, a well-known published poet, a sculptor, and a member of the Royal Society of Sculptors, I believe. And I'm very grateful that you're here to do this evening, so thank you very much.
Pleasure.
Other than that, any questions, please reserve them to the end. There will be a Q&A, and I will leave it to you guys. Oh, we'll just squeeze this two in.
What we're going to do this evening is to have really roughly for the next hour a conversation about Jennifer's work. We're going to talk, Jennifer and I are going to talk for about 20 minutes about some of the themes of her book and about her life. Then we're going to have the treat of Jennifer reading a group of her poems from the book for about another 20 minutes. And then what we're hoping to do is to have a question and answer for the final 20 minutes. And we hope that you will all come up with some interesting questions that you won't be shy about fielding at Jennifer, to just carry on the discussion around the issues that are raised by the book. Jennifer, I've known Jennifer for a while now. I think we all know her very much from her as the founding director of Exiled Writers Inc. and her stalwart work in promoting the work of contemporary refugee writers. And she puts an enormous amount of energy into that, and I'm sure a lot of you that are here tonight really appreciate that. But she's also a poet, and has been for some time. We've known each other from various angles, which we'll sort of explore together for you. I'd just like to sort of say about this really splendid book, The Search. About half the poems I've known because we've discussed them in workshops and at meetings, and half of them that I don't know. But I think there's a very sort of coherent line of narrative from the first poem, Where Do You Really Come From, right through to the last poem, which is a fantastic poem at the end of the book called The Woman's Hair. There's a narrative of the search, there's a narrative of the search for identity, and of beginning to understand who you are, which I think is very pertinent to those of you who maybe have come from another country and have had that refugee experience. I particularly was intrigued by the first poem, Where Do You Really Come From? And I just want to read a couple of lines from this. I'm English, I said. I was born here. She replied, yes, I know, but where do you really come from? And I can remember that, we were talking about this yesterday morning, I can remember somebody saying that to me, and where do you come from? So I said, well, I come from Brixton in South London. But where do you really come from? I really come from Brixton in South London. But where do you really come from? Well, I really come from Brixton in South London. I suddenly realised what this investigation was all about. I come from a refugee family. My mother was a refugee from Berlin in the 1930s. And Jennifer comes from a refugee family who came over in the 1930s. And although we were born here, we're very, very conscious of, as second generation, this second generation issue of where have we come from. And the book really explores this, I think, in very interesting, emotionally interesting ways, and intellectually interesting ways. And I hope that Jennifer and I can explore that a bit between us. So, did you feel a little bit defensive when somebody said to you, where do you really come from? As opposed to me saying, well, I just came from Brixton. I wasn't going to go any further. But you felt a little bit more defensive about it.
Certainly, I was actually astounded. I was at a wake for one of our writers who had died. And I was sitting in the garden chatting to a lady, and this was in Surrey, and then she suddenly asked me where I came from, and it was about 2 years ago that I had this experience, and I couldn't quite believe I was being sort of asked this, because, you know, having lived here for so long and been born here, I just was quite taken back, really, by the question and the sensibility that I realised was I was being confronted with, that I didn't really belong, that I was an outsider. And yes, I am born of a complex identity in my view. German, Jewish, English, and I think when I was growing up the German identity dominated, actually, because my parents spoke German to each other, we ate German food, I wore German clothes, I visited Germany on several occasions with my parents when I was a child. And yet there was a kind of ambiguity about their relationship with Germany. I realised sort of later that they were nostalgic, very nostalgic for the lives they'd had pre-Hitler, but yet they experienced, you know, this atrocities and which led to trauma. So I think that's all I will say at this point.
Well, that leads very nicely into your second poem, Language of My Homeland. And I just want to read a little piece here that really caught my attention. And I'd just like to say the Red Cross Tracing Service, as mentioned in this, was the tracing service that was set up by the Red Cross in 1945 to trace the whereabouts of millions of displaced people in Europe. I mean, you know, millions and millions of displaced people, as well as trying to trace the fate of those who've been killed in the Holocaust. It was a massive job that went on, I think, for about 5 years, about 45 to 1950. And it's mentioned in this poem, and the poem says, "My parents' secret conversations, their problems and anxieties, still no reply from the Red Cross Tracing Service. Still their families will their families be traced now or ever?" To me, it was wall-to-wall German. The language seeped in stealthily, natürlich. And that I thought was really an interesting stanza, because it suggests that you were overhearing this. You were this new English girl that was growing up in England, but you were listening to your parents' conversation in German and picking up a few details. And what did you feel about that? I mean, the language, the German language, was both something that was home, but also something that was very frightening.
Well, yes. Yes, I think there was definitely an ambiguity about the language, because it was a language of home and yet it was the language of the perpetrators. And although now I can be very rational about my relationship to Germany and can consider Germany as having turned over a new leaf, there's a new discourse willingness and urgency for redemption. On the emotional side, I still feel a sort of discomfort when I hear the language. So it's kind of about the rational versus the emotional. And I do remember when I visited Berlin in 1999, it was, going to the east because Berlin was still divided between East and West then. Oh no, it wasn't. But anyway, no, forget. No, that was 89. But when one went to the east, you know, it was very run down. There were dusty bookshop windows with tomes about the lost Jews of Germany, vanished Jews of Germany, with sort of religious men, black-hatted, white-bearded on the covers. And in the poem I say, I want to sing and shout out, it wasn't like that. I know my mother told me she went shopping at KaDeWe, which was a store, had, you know, cake, Kuchen and Schlagsahne, cakes and cream, played tennis at the sports club, etc., etc. You know, so I present a different narrative. However, I think perhaps it's important to bring in the theory that Marianne Hirsch has presented about the second generation, the transgenerational transmission of trauma from the first generation to the second generation. So what Marianne Hirsch says is that you know, trauma is inherited from the first generation by the second generation, but not explicitly. The parents, for example, never sat down and talked to their children to explain exactly what happened to them, for the simple reason that they were traumatized. This was a subject that was impossible to address, especially for my parents, who were both the only survivors of their respective families. And so I'm not sure that I agree with Marianne Hirsch that the trauma is the same trauma that the parents experience is transmitted to the next generation, but there's still the knowledge that you know, one's parents were deeply affected by loss, and I grew up with photographs of my parents' immediate family members in the living room, but I chose not to ask questions. I wouldn't have known what to ask, and sort of fragments were transmitted to me, but since then I have done a great deal of research, you know, more and more over the years, and those people on the photographs, I realise now, would have been my grandparents, uncles, aunts, cousins, and those were concepts that were alien to me really growing up, because I was an only child. It was just me and my parents. Whereas in Germany they had extended families, you know, so over the years I've done research, and I've become closer. I feel I've become closer to those people who I first saw in the photographs and whose names I've seen on Holocaust lists of the murdered. And I'm probably wandering around, but so with regard to Germany and Germans, I did find myself in a place called Swakopmund in Namibia, which was a colony of German Southwest Africa up to about the First World War, and it said that a lot of Nazis escaped there and found refuge there. And it's a town that's on the coast, sort of between a coastal town which you reach by travelling across this immense desert. And it looks like a Bavarian town. It's really incongruous with, you know, timbered houses, everyone speaking German, We stayed in a guest house in which I felt very, very uncomfortable. I felt I was in a different era, and I couldn't wait to leave, and I've written a poem about that. So before I talked about the sort of dynamic, the tension between being rational about the German language and emotional. So here my emotions came to the fore in former German Southwest Africa.
And it's very interesting how one wants to still have a relationship with the origins of one's family. You know, the country. One still wants to have a relationship with the original country of one's family. You know, it's very important, and yet one has this double take all the time. You've got this poem, Carnival Float, which I think is really interesting, where you talk about young people refugees who have come to camps in England in the 1930s. And these were camps that were quite rough and ready, you know, and be cold in the winter. But they were part of a transition when refugees from Germany and Austria and Italy, actually, also that also came into the picture, managed to get the visas to arrive in England. There were camps that were set up in Kent, which were actually run at one time by a woman called Anna Essinger, who'd set up the Bunce Court School in Kent, which is where my mother came to when she was a girl, when she first came on. But I thought it was an interesting series of images that you've got here of these camps, and how that connects with camps that you've been to today, refugee camps you've been to today over in Calais. I just wonder whether you'd like to make a comment about that.
Right.
Because there's a very interesting connection between your refugee experience of your parents and the refugee experience that you're campaigning for now.
Yes, the book isn't only about my personal search, but it's how I interact with contemporary refugees, and I do feel an affinity and very connected to them. And I think that's both because I was the daughter of refugees and felt an outsider, and obviously I'm still perceived as an outsider by once you get out into leafy Surrey. Okay. My father had been incarcerated in a concentration camp, which wasn't the likes of Auschwitz. Jews weren't gassed then, but there were executions. Guard dogs drove men onto the electric fence and they were killed. There was hardly any food or water. My father collected rainwater in a hat. And I don't know about this because I know about this not because he told me, but because I found a testimony he had written for a library in London called the Wiener Library. That testimony was in German and I had it translated, and I was really shocked because I had no idea of what he had encountered, what the ordeal, what the extent of the ordeal. But at that time, the Nazis wanted to get rid of the Jews, and as the dark and dangerous times were closing in, they felt compelled to flee if they possibly could, but no country would accept them. It was so difficult to get visas. America had quotas. So that's an analogy you can draw with today, you know, the reluctance of Britain to host refugees, even the Afghan refugees, the Syrian refugees, quotas, you know, etc. And anyway, so a camp was set up by the Central British Fund for German Jewry because the British government refused to pay for it. And it was intended to be a transit camp. Britain didn't want the Jews to stay in general. There was a lot of animosity towards Jews in the 30s. Doctors were not welcome. It was felt jobs, you know, that Jews would take jobs from the indigenous population, all the rest of it. So this camp was called Kitchener Camp, and it was near Sandwich in Kent. And it had been a First World War barracks, and it all needed renovation, and so they got the men building, you know, bunks and so on. And now Exiled Writers Inc. has been to Calais, and again the French were not exactly welcoming of the refugees. I mean, they weren't even in barracks there, they were in tents. Yeah, you know all this narrative. We squelched through mud. You know, there was no system for providing clothes, shoes, food. Everything was provided by volunteers. Stanley helped some Sudanese cut down some wood for making a fire, I believe, and so it goes on. So there are analogies, and in terms of the lack of a welcome by the host countries, the racism, the hostile environment, and but at Kitchener Camp there were compulsory English lessons. There was the opportunity to play table tennis, so there were some facilities. So in that sense, it was better than the
Well, it was
Calais.
very much make do and mend, wasn't it?
I beg your pardon?
Make do and mend is very much make
Yes,
do
it
and
was.
mend. Yeah. Jennifer, I mean, you've done fantastic work with the Exiled Writers Inc. and other things that you've been pursuing. Let's come back to you. There's I thought a couple of very interesting poems in the book. History Pursues Me and Pursuing Lost Time, which seem to talk about this attempt to still understand the past and what it's created in you now. And there's a very interesting stanza here in the poem Pursuing Lost Time, which is the penultimate poem of the book. You say, once, face one, hair flying, I wandered the streets of Berlin, searching for murdered relatives. Only ghosts lurk in the pale winter below the crying sky. That's a great image, the crying sky. And then you talk about meeting people who might have known your ancestors. And I thought that phrase, searching for murdered relatives, summed up so much of the desire to understand the past, but also the impossibility of understanding the past.
Yes.
And that it's both somehow a fact and a fiction. And yet the whole book seems to be an attempt to try to come to some understanding of that desire in you to psychologically put something together again. Talk about that.
Yes. I think you know, we, the second generation, can become quite obsessed, if that's not too strong a word, about the past, and we somehow believe that if we keep searching the records, if we visit the places where our parents' families had lived, we might somehow retrieve the past. We might, it might suddenly become ours. And I don't think nostalgia's involved. I think it's really strange, actually, though, because when I first visited my father, or intended to visit my father's family's home, I talked about returning, and yet I had never been there. I had seen photos, and maybe I had heard some fragments of stories in the background, you know, in my parents' conversation. But invariably, when you do arrive at these places, there are only ghosts. You sort of, somehow, there's the expectation that you might, you know, discover something, find somebody.